Hi, welcome to my presentation, Knowing is Half the Battle, a Librarian OER Needs Assessment. My name is Beth Rukin-Shepard, and I am the Instruction Coordinator Librarian at the University of South Alabama. My contact information is right here, and please make a note that everything in this presentation is part of the Creative Commons. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So here's what we're going to be talking about today in the presentation. We're going to start with the why, so what the project context was. Then we're going to move on to my research design and methodology for my project. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the assessment instrument itself, how I designed that and how I disseminated the assessment instrument. Then we're going to do a quick look at the results. And then the majority of the presentation today, we're going to be talking about the 10 major takeaways, so really kind of the results and discussion part of my project. Then lastly, we're going to look at kind of where to, ideas for potential further research, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Okay, so let's talk about project context. This project came out of the Spark Open Education Leadership Program. I was a member of that project last year, and it was amazing. And it started very differently than it finished. So my joke here is that everything is in beta. And originally my project was a adoption toolkit for librarians at regional institutions. I wanted to create something that would make it easy for librarians to adopt OER initiatives. But I really figured out very quickly that I needed to know more than I already knew. So I really wanted to create something valuable and relevant to the librarians in my population that I had identified at regional institutions. So I needed to find out what they really needed. And so any self-respecting librarian, I turned to the literature. Well, there really wasn't any literature. While the literature of open education is really heavy with faculty needs assessment, and you can see some of the citations I have listed here, very little research has been done to understand the needs of the librarians working in this space. As a community, we've spent so much time and been so preoccupied with making our case to faculty, university administrators, state legislatures, and students that we really neglected to ask the people who work on the front lines of open education how they feel or what kinds of support or education they need. Or at least the neglect is documented in the lack of scholarship on the topic. So I thought, okay, we'll start there. We'll actually conduct a needs assessment of these people. And originally my plan was to conduct a needs assessment of librarians just working at regional institutions. But very quickly I realized that that had two issues. One, disseminating that information or the assessment instrument to those librarians was tricky. And then secondly, I thought, well, why am I make a mistake in limiting that research scope? So instead I thought, okay, I'll design a needs assessment for all librarians, and I'll build in ways that will ultimately allow me to drill down based on Carnegie classification, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the actual assessment instrument itself. So that's kind of where the project started. And it continued to evolve throughout my entire capstone project. But ultimately I ended up with designing this as my final research method or research project. So a little bit about my method and design. I kind of wanted to start working backwards from what I wanted to know. So I really needed to determine my purpose. And so ultimately I decided that the purpose was to determine the extent of OER institutionally sponsored initiatives at institutions and determine the information, things like education and training and support, time, tangible resources, marketing materials, etc., that these librarians at these institutions without sponsored initiatives might need. So once I had defined the purpose, I needed to define my participants, and that was pretty easy. I identified my participants as librarians, library staff, and I also decided to include library deans and directors, as I wanted kind of a maybe larger institutional focus for some questions. And this actually ended up being pretty interesting later on. Like any good person designing a research project, my next questions, I needed to figure out what my research questions were. So I wanted to know, what is the status of an institutionally sponsored OER program at your institution? What is the participants' knowledge of open education and OER? What might be the barriers of implementation? And how might these barriers be unique to your particular population, meaning librarians? What are the participants' perceptions and attitudes as related to OER? And lastly, what are librarians' desired forms of support? My method was pretty simplistic. I decided to do a survey via questionnaire, and we'll talk a little bit more about the instrument in a second. I also needed to get IRB approval from my institution to do any kind of later publishing. And then a little bit about the dissemination. So I decided that the easiest way to probably disseminate this would be through listservs and on Twitter. And I'm really glad that I did, because this happened right about the time that we all went remote thanks to COVID-19. So the dissemination was a little tricky, and I'm not really sure what kind of ultimate response or what kind of impact COVID-19 had on my overall response, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Ultimately, my data analysis model ended up being a simplistic comparison of a group mean, which is, again, a very simplistic data analysis method, but one that really worked for kind of the questions that I sent out. Okay, so a little bit about the instrument itself. I determined to use a Google form over our university's proprietary survey tool, which is Qualtrics. And I chose this because for the ease of sharing and ultimately remixing. Again, that idea of putting it in the Creative Commons and allowing other people to use it and modify it, the 5 R's. Yes, Google Forms was not as robust in what it allowed me to do, like something like Qualtrics would have been, but it ended up being just fine. So a little bit about the structure of the assessment. It's in 6 sections, and so I started with a simple question about the status of an OER initiative. So as you can see here, this is the first screenshot of the first question. But before this, on its welcome screen, I also had defined what the school-sponsored or institutionally sponsored OER program was. And this ended up being a contingency question. So if you answered yes, then I asked you to move on to your demographic data. And if you did not have a school-sponsored OER initiative, then we moved on throughout the rest of the survey. The remaining 5 sections was some questions about your knowledge of OER, barriers to implementation, perceptions of OER benefits, desired forms of support, and then some demographic information. And the demographic information, again, is kind of what allowed me to drill down and separate out some responses. The question composition for my assessment included dichotomous questions, semantic differential questions, largely in the form of a Likert scale, and then each section also included a few open-ended questions. So a little bit about my results. I had 112 respondents, which actually, I think is pretty good considering when the instrument went out, the call for participants went out. But to be full disclosure, as anybody should in the research project, there were some limitations to my study, and they're largely dependent upon participant sample size. I would love to get more than 112 respondents. I know there's more than 112 librarians potentially interested in working in the open education space in higher education. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is my dissemination method, I think potentially skewed the results in that it went out to people who might potentially already be interested in open education, right? Who already may have some of the supports in place that I'm asking about in my question. So again, the whole point of this is just to kind of assess the landscape of librarian need working in OER, and to kind of begin the conversation about identifying those needs. Again, those librarians working in open education are not a monolithic group, meaning that some librarians have a very different knowledge or institutional culture, lots of different things that make surveys like this or questionnaires like this kind of problematic. But it allows space to take the research a little bit further. So I hope that people can use or modify my collection instrument and my data continue to explore this question. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the results, let's talk about my takeaways. So my first takeaway is really a suggestion for a curricular focus shift. So how we teach librarians about open education, the professional development that we do. Ultimately, the results from the librarians surveyed without OER initiatives suggest that professional development education and curriculum for librarians should shift from a focus on discovery of OER to creation and adaptation. And I should say in all the following slides, you'll see a graph, and all the discussion I will be referring back to each corresponding graph. So the highest averages of confidence, discovery, and evaluation at 3.36 and 3.05 seem to suggest that OER have entered the mainstream of the librarian professional conversation, and thus the discovery of quality OER is less of a concern for librarians. This might be related to the proliferation of large-scale OER repositories, things like Merlot and OpenStax, who make the discovery of OER resources really simple. They're huge warehouses and they're really well described, so it's easy to find things. The lowest averages of confidence, creation and adaptation at 2.55 and 2.64, seem to suggest that the current state of OER education and professional development for librarians has outgrown its curriculum. I suggest that these curriculums can be redesigned to focus more on the creation of OER rather than discovery. And this may have something to do with the fact that teaching faculty are becoming more and more comfortable with the concept of open education resources, and we see this in things like the Hewitt Foundation report every year. So maybe librarians are being called on more and more to help with creation rather than simply discovery. And this mirrors my own personal experience. My next takeaway is another curriculum focus shift, but it's related to advocacy. And here the data suggests that librarians feel very confident advocating for the use of OER and open pedagogy with student and faculty groups, but less so when advocating to senior university administration and policymakers at the regional and state levels, as you can see from the graph here. It's really not surprising, considering librarians generally work with faculty and students and probably feel more comfortable with those groups. But perhaps open education professional development for librarians could attempt to ameliorate this issue by focusing more on developing strategies for advocating to these groups. Suggested areas include grant writing and proposal writing. My next takeaway has to do with overcoming barriers. Unsurprisingly, a lack of time and funding at 4.26 and 3.83 were the highest potential barriers for adoption to OER and open education, according to the librarians surveyed. And this is not a shock. I mean, if you talk to anyone in higher education, this is a problem. However, the next two largest potential barriers, faculty awareness and institutional policies, may have a direct impact on the previous two potential barriers. Many of the additional open comments suggested that library administration did not give value to open education and OER, noting, quote, a lack of library administration awareness, or, quote, senior library administration engagement, and sentiments such as, quote, it's not the library's responsibility to push such an initiative from a member of the library administration. It's my opinion that if library administration is unwilling to support open education initiatives with staff and funding and make adoption a strategic initiative, then of course librarians doing the work will note a lack of those potential and essential resources. Perhaps going forward, a focus of the community should be to educate library administration and university administration on the value of open education and really how to tie open education and OER to larger campus-wide initiatives and the all-important university strategic plan. This would help demonstrate the need for additional funding and staffing. My next takeaway has to do with librarian attitude and perceptions. And as you can see from the graph here, generally librarians have a pretty positive perception of OER, shocker, and see it as a very valuable thing for their institution and their institutional context. But what was really interesting is how they'd like to see interest generated on their campus and within their campus community. The librarian survey desire an increased awareness of OER and open education on their campuses, but they don't want this awareness to be generated through the traditional ideas of workshops and professional development. This information could have implications for the kinds of OER materials librarians in the community produce for other librarians. Historically, there has been a proliferation of workshops generated in the Commons. Perhaps the creation of open, library-focused materials should shift to a more marketing approach. Suggestions include social media awareness strategies, images, infographics, awareness marketing materials, OER programming, and activities focused on the user community. What librarians want? That's the big question, right? The data represented on this slide and in this graph really support the suggestion that I made in my last slide. The librarians surveyed here rated marketing materials directed at generating faculty awareness as the third most desired form of support. Conversely, librarians ranked marketing materials directed at generating student awareness as the lowest desired form of support in the category. This information seems to suggest that there's a need for librarians who have graphic design and communication background to generate marketing materials for the commons for librarians who do not have this skill set. The results of this question also support the assertions made in my first takeaway related to the desired curriculum shift by suggesting that more focus should be placed on open education pedagogy and best practices in the library professional development and education. As this desire tied for the most second desired form of support, perhaps the curriculum focus should shift from discovery of OER to more time spent on creation, adaptation, advocacy, and open pedagogy. A little bit more about what librarians want. As librarianship is a profession rooted in collaboration and best practices, it's not surprising at all that the most desired form of support for librarians is examples of successful OER initiatives from other libraries. Although this information does exist out there, the creation of a searchable, by kind of initiative, repository for successful OER initiatives might be worth exploring. I know it would have been really helpful in the beginning of my OER journey. Within this repository, librarians could share all associated documentation of their successful initiatives. Suggestions include grant proposals, associated forms and documents, marketing materials, workflows, and project management strategies. I know for me, writing my initial grant for my open education initiative on campus, I borrowed heavily from some of my awesome colleagues in the open education space, and it really helped me not having to create this stuff from scratch. But I knew to reach out to these folks. A repository would kind of remove that middleman or that reaching out. This kind of searchable repository would allow librarians to quickly identify the kind of initiative that would work best at their institution and locate reusable resources as opposed to creating them from scratch. Considering that librarians are constantly strapped for time and money, perhaps a repository like this will help ameliorate or alleviate some of that stress. Okay, a couple general findings. And this picture just kills me considering what's it like to be in a crowd, right? We've totally forgotten what that's like. But kind of a big general statement that I'd like to make is that it's time for open education, for us to open up open education within librarianship. Historically, open education and OER have been the domain of the public service librarian. As you can see from the responses to the questionnaire, the majority of respondents were in public service. But ask any librarian and they'll tell you that a library is a system that does not work without all of its parts. So it's really important that we open up this conversation around open education to our systems and collection development, management, and acquisitions colleagues. As the need for OER grows and the amount of resources available grow, the ability to discover these resources through library EDS and OPACs is more important than ever. Okay, so that's the major takeaways. What's next? Again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. It really only begins the conversation about assessing librarian needs with respect to open education and OER. While the data in my survey can be used as a start, it's only, again, a very small sample of librarians. Like I mentioned before, the limitations of the study, largely the size of participants and the method of participant solicitation, really already have the potential to skew the results and give a very, very limited picture of the landscape. But because there is such an existing lack of librarian needs assessment in the open education space, there's so much more room for data gathering to provide us a better picture of librarian needs, particularly in the areas of education and professional development. While my project took a shotgun approach needs assessment, my hope is that people will take my survey instrument, distribute it to smaller, more select, and potentially homogeneous populations. And I'm thinking things along the lines of school Carnegie classifications, service populations, regions, etc., and fill in a little bit of the blanks that are out there. So that's really kind of a rough look at my needs assessment, and I would love to entertain questions and maybe just have a discussion. So I really hope this presentation accomplished its goal of getting that conversation started. And if you'd like to reach out to chat, ask questions, or suggest further areas for research, I'm hanging out in a Google Chat meeting room right now. So you can either type that URL into your search box, or you can find the link in the video description below. Thanks, guys.